The Caribbean is a minute contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, but will be among the most severely
extreme weather events such as the 2000 select crops that can thrive in extreme conditions.
Don't know about climate change.
Good evening. My name is Kenrick Leslie, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. And at this time, I would like to invite you to stand for the national anthem of Barbados. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Before I declare the meeting open, I would like to remind all of you one of the main reasons for having the launch of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report in Barbados. Because 20 years ago, when we had the first SIDS meeting, the Barbados Plan of Action was declared in 1994. And recently in Samoa, we celebrated the 20 years anniversary. So we felt from the center it was only fitting to have the launch of the Fifth Assessment in Barbados. Moreover, I feel myself as a citizen for several reasons. My grandfather came from Barbados, and my nephew and my niece decided to keep up the tradition between Belize and Barbados. My nephew's wife is from Barbados, and my niece's husband is from Barbados. So I feel right at home at this time in Barbados. I am especially pleased and happy to welcome our special guest speakers and panelists. This evening's keynote speaker, the Honorable Dennis Lowe, Minister of the Environment and Drainage in Barbados. Dr. Warren Smith, from the president of CDB, should have been here, but because of other factors, he is being represented by Mr. Nigel Romano, Vice President of Operations. Mr. Selwyn Hart, who is no stranger to any of us here, he is now the Director of the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team in New York. We have Mr. Patrick McCaskey, the SIDS representative of the Green Climate Fund Board. Dr. Leonard Nurse, Senior Lecturer at the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of the West Indies Cave campus. But also, he is the Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. We have Ms. Rai, Disaster Management Officer, International Federation and the Red Crescent Societies, in Port of Spain, Trinidad. We have a fourth panelist who will join us virtually this evening. He is Professor Christopher Field, co-chair of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He is at Stanford University. Also, I would like to extend a special welcome to members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Board of the Green Climate Fund, members of the media in general, but especially to those who have traveled from Belize, Jamaica, and Guyana to be present at this special launching of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Finally, I would like to welcome all those listeners who are joining us via the internet using the live stream, those following on social media, including Twitter and Facebook, and to members of the audience present. The official hashtag for this event is Caribbean Climate. The program tonight will consist of two parts. The first will be statements from our guest speakers. This will be followed by presentations from our panelists, followed by questions and answer period. Before starting the program, I would like to acknowledge the support, financially and otherwise, provided to the 5 Cs by our collaborative partners, the Caribbean Development Bank and the Climate Development and Knowledge Network. Without the support provided by these partners, tonight's event would be possible. I would also like to acknowledge Professor John Agard, who is right here in front of us. Professor, could you stand, sir, so they can recognize who Professor Agard is? Who is in the audience, and Professor Agard is also one of the lead authors of the chapter on small island states for Working Group 2 of the IPCC report. He has traveled, as you can see, from Port of Spain to be with us tonight, a resource person, especially during the question and answer periods. At this time, I would also like to acknowledge in the audience Dr. Ulrich Kratz. He is the Deputy Executive Director of the Climate Change Center. We have Dr. Bino, who is our resource economist. And I would also like to acknowledge one of our board members who is in the audience, Ms. Dixon. Could you stand, Ms. Dixon? A very special person. At this time, I would like to remind you that climate change is an inevitable and urgent global challenge with long-term implications for sustainable development of all countries. Climate change and sustainable development are inextricably linked. While climate change will know no boundaries, poor and developing countries, particularly the LDCs and SIDS, those most adversely affected and least able to cope with the anticipated impacts on their social, economic, and natural systems. Let us this evening bear in mind the need for the poor developing countries to experience sustainable development under these circumstances. During the next 2 hours, you will hear presentations from our guest speakers and panelists, the findings of the latest assessment of the state of the Earth's climate, and in particular, the implications to our region's long-term socio-economic development. It is our expectation that we will have full participation during the question and answer period. As such, we will devote at least 40 minutes for that exchange. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to call on our first speaker, Mr. Nigel Romano, Vice President of the Operations Caribbean Development Bank. Mr. Romano.
Very much. Dr. Dennis Lowe, Minister of the Environment and Drainage, Barbados. Dr. Kenrick Leslie, Executive Director, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and other members of the 5Cs board and staff. Mr. Selwyn Hart, Director, UN Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team. Panelists, Dr. Leonard Nurse, Leon Charles, Priyadarshini Rai, Professor Christopher Field, Patrick McCaskey, SIDS Representative, Green Climate Fund Board, members of the Diplomatic Corps, representatives and other members of the Green Climate Fund, other government officials, staff members of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center and the CDB, media representatives from Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. First, for the absence of Dr. Smith. He's been very busy over the last few weeks. He's almost been living on a plane. On behalf of the Caribbean Development Bank, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the Small Island Development States chapter of the 5th assessment report of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here in the region, we are familiar with the adverse impacts of climate variability and change, and in particular, how it has affected our the last 2 decades. The recent effects of unseasonal weather in December 2013, which caused death and destruction in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia and Dominica, come readily to mind. And as I speak, Antigua and Barbuda are being impacted by, I forget the name of the hurricane, or the tropical storm. And other countries are being similarly affected. Earlier this year, we also saw the impact of drought in a number of BMCs, including Jamaica. In the case of Jamaica, the rainfall for January to June 2014 was only 33% of the normal rainfall for that period. Patterns of precipitation, increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes, and other issues such as the effects on human health associated with vector, food, and waterborne diseases, and chikungunya comes readily to mind in that regard, pose serious threats to the region's sustainable development agenda. Therefore, the question is not if we will take action, but what measures should be implemented, at what cost, and how do we finance these actions, since any delay will only mean higher costs later on. Based on the actions required to transition to more climate-resilient economies will require massive investment. The annual adaptation costs for the Caribbean will be a significant percentage of individual annual GNP, and the rate of climate change and its attendant costs are expected to accelerate if the concentration of greenhouse gases continues to increase. Although the Caribbean is not a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, we acknowledge that we do have a part to play in reducing our carbon footprint, particularly by taking steps which result in improved local environmental conditions and support a more low-carbon and climate-resilient development path. I want to underscore an important element of the Caribbean Regional Climate Change Strategy and Implementation Plan, approved by our heads of government, that of knowledge building and dissemination. This is of particular urgency as our ability to plan and make sound decisions are inhibited by inadequate climate and environment data sets. CDB is committed to continuing our work with regional institutions that are leading in building technical capacity. The Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, the 5 Cs, University of the West Indies, and the Caribbean Public Health Agency. We support further deeper collaboration among these agencies and other institutions. Their work is very important in building the knowledge that is critical to supporting decision making to address climate change. Complementing the process of building technical capacities and increasing public awareness is critical. Our investment needs are great. Therefore, easier access and more concessionary climate finance are matters of the highest priority for the CDB and our borrowing member countries. We look forward to the continuing evolution of the Green Climate Fund, and I'm glad they are visiting with us this week in Barbados, as it positions itself to combat climate change through its unique mechanism, i.e., direct access to countries and regional institutions. In closing, I congratulate the authors of the 5th IPCC report and all who have contributed to its completion. We are particularly proud that some of our distinguished scholars and academics continue to contribute to the work of the IPCC. And this evening we are particularly delighted to have here with us distinguished academic and Barbadian son of the soil, Dr. Leonard Nurse, who has made an outstanding contribution to the work of the IPCC, and in particular as one of the coordinating lead authors of the SIDS chapter of the 5th Assessment Report. We hope this report will serve to enhance the region's knowledge on climate change and help to promote real, viable action among all stakeholders. Thank you.
Kindly join me once again to thank the Speaker, Vice President Romano from the CDB, for that encouraging address in terms of the role that CDB can play in helping our regional governments, our countries, in addressing the issues of climate change. He highlighted a number of points which I will not elaborate at this point, but we will bring it back as we continue this meeting. I would like to apologize. I missed that in the opening for the late start. As my colleagues, I'm a person that believes in punctuality. Unfortunately, we experienced some technical difficulties in terms of the communication system, and we felt it was important that we resolve those difficulties before starting. So once again, I'd like to apologize for the late start. And at this point in time, I would like to call on Mr. Selwyn Hart. Selwyn, over the years, has been one of our chief negotiators in terms of what's going on at the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. But at this time, he will be addressing us as the director of that special team put together by the United Nations Secretary General in terms of how we can get all countries involved. And he will give us an overview of the recent outcomes that took place in New York City not too long ago. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Selwyn Hart to the podium.
Dr. Leslie, thanks for that introduction. Distinguished Minister, Mr. Romano, Dr. Nurse, other distinguished guests, panelists, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset thank the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center and the Caribbean Development Bank for inviting me to speak at this historic Caribbean launch of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. This report is the 5th report from the most authoritative scientific body on climate change. Each successive report over the past 2 decades has painted a more sobering picture of the state of the global climate system. The calls for an urgent and aggressive response to this challenge have grown increasingly louder over the past 2 decades. And while these reports have informed the global discourse on climate change, the reality is that the political and economic responses to this challenge have fallen short of the demands of science. To many of you in this room from the Caribbean, whether you're a scientist, a farmer, a fisherman, a business person, a student, a policymaker, or simply an ordinary citizen, the findings of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC come as no surprise. The evidence of increasingly severe impacts of climate change and rising sea levels are evident throughout. 7 Caribbean countries are among the top 10 countries which suffered the highest economic losses from climate-related disasters as a percentage of GDP during the period 1993 to 2012, and this was contained in the Global Climate Risk Index of 2014. The report's headline messages that human influence on the global climate system is clear, and that without urgent action within less than a decade to peak and aggressively reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, and that we risk increasingly pervasive and irreversible impacts, should serve as a wake-up call to the world and ensure that climate change is at the top of the global agenda. As the UN Secretary General has said, climate change is the defining issue of our time. It is defining our present. Our response will define our future. Therefore, the Caribbean cannot simply ride out this global crisis and hope for the best. Our region must be at the forefront of the global response to climate change. One of the more positive messages coming from the 5th assessment report is that despite a closing window of opportunity to act, the world has the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous, sustainable future. The report asserts that it is both affordable and technically feasible to transition to a low-carbon economy. Aligning the science, politics, and economics of climate change is therefore essential to transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. At the September 23rd Climate Summit convened by the UN Secretary General, we heard overwhelming commitments to a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway from governments, business, and the finance community, as well as representatives from civil society. The Climate Summit was historic in many ways and achieved the 2 objectives set by the Secretary General, namely to mobilize political will towards an ambitious agreement in Paris in 2015, and secondly, to catalyze ambitious action on the ground through multi-stakeholder coalitions. The summit brought together over 100 heads of state and government from around the world, making it the largest ever gathering of heads of state and government on climate change. They were joined by over 300 titans of finance and CEOs, as well as leaders from civil society organizations, along with 250 subnational actors who all made pledges at the summit. This was backed by nearly 400,000 persons marching in the streets of New York City, and the biggest ever coalition of mobilized citizens the world has ever seen on climate change. We heard strong commitments from all leaders for a meaningful universal agreement in Paris next year, and leaders reaffirmed their determination to limit global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius by cutting emissions. The summit also catalyzed significant action to reduce emissions, to strengthen resilience, and to mobilize money and move markets in a low-carbon, climate-resilient direction. For example, on forests, the New York Declaration on Forests was launched and supported by over 150 partners, including 28 governments and other stakeholders, and they committed to halve the loss of forests globally by 2020. On energy, a coalition of governments, development banks, private investors committed to creating an 8,000-kilometer-long African clean energy corridor from Cairo to the Cape. The SIDS Lighthouse Initiative was also launched, enabling small island developing states to strategically deploy renewables on their own terms with partner support. Some 25 small island developing states this initiative, and the partners supporting them include the European Union, France, Germany, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, United Arab Emirates, and the United States. On resilience, the CRIF was showcased as a regional best practice. A compact of mayors signed 1,000 cities pledging new action on climate change was also signed. On finance, a new coalition of governments, business, finance, multilateral banks, and civil society leaders announced the intent to mobilize over $200 billion for financial carbon development. The insurance industry committed to doubling its green investments to $84 billion by the end of 2015, and commercial banks committed to issuing $30 billion in green bonds by next year. Over $2 billion was pledged to the Green Climate Fund, with more donors coming on board in November. Last, and by no means least, the summit provided a new narrative and rationale for action. In addition to the moral and scientific imperative, the economic case for climate action is now clear and compelling. Leaders from government, the private sector, including finance and civil society, are converging around the message that there's no need to choose between economic growth and reducing emissions. Countries can do both together. Indeed, tackling climate change provides economic benefits. The summit has launched a race towards a low-carbon resilient future. But where does the Caribbean stand, and what is in it for the Caribbean? And I just want to make 3 points in closing. First, I believe it was Winston Churchill that once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." The climate crisis and the ongoing challenges the region faces in recovering from the global economic crisis of 2008 represent a unique opportunity for the Caribbean to do things you thought you could not do before. At the climate summit, the Prime Minister of Grenada challenged his colleagues from the islands to go 100% renewable. Why couldn't Caribbean governments and the private sector and its development partners accept this challenge and rally around this effort? The Green Climate Fund is in the final stages of operationalization and will be open for business over the course of the next few months. This represents a new source of grant and concessionary financing of the region to achieve a vision such as that which was articulated by the Prime Minister of Grenada. Second, the Caribbean needs to think and act as a region and must utilize the comparative advantage, harness the institutional strengths of its regional, and harness the institutional strengths of its regional institutions. The regional architecture for responding to climate change is already in place. The 5Cs is already the regional scientific and technical body coordinating the regional response. The CARICOM Secretariat needs to play a more assertive role coordinating the regional's diplomatic and political efforts. And CDB must be further empowered by the countries themselves to play the role it was set up to do, to play the role of the regional financial intermediary for climate change financing channeled to our region. Mr. Romano so eloquently stated, CDB is well positioned and prepared to play this role. Third and lastly, all segments of society and the economy must be mobilized towards this collective effort. The summit demonstrated the power of governments, business, and civil society working together, supported by a mobilized and well-informed public. Distinguished moderator, the science in the fifth assessment report is clear, and it is now our duty and responsibility to take the science and translate it into strategic policy and climate action. The Caribbean has never been so well placed to lead on climate action. Your vulnerability gives you moral authority. Your innovation and action establish your leadership. And it is this unique position that the Caribbean should leverage to drive others to the level of ambition that will ensure a sustainable and prosperous future for all. I thank you.
I think Mr. Hart deserves a second applause. He delivered what I had hoped to hear of how we in the Caribbean, our leaders, our institutions, and especially the Caribbean Development Bank, what we need to do to ensure that when the Green Climate Fund becomes, we will be ready to make use, and not as in the other developmental financial mechanisms where we allowed other countries to move ahead of us. So I'm extremely pleased both with our first speaker, Mr. Romano from the CDB, and Mr. Hart for giving us the guidelines in which we should follow to ensure that we are successful in addressing the impacts of climate change. And at this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. the Honorable Dennis Lowe, who will bring the third leg of what we need to do, the political aspects of climate change. Honorable Minister, please join me at the podium.
Thank you very much, distinguished moderator. Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Environment and Drainage, Mr. Edison Allen, and other government officials. Director, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Dr. Kenrick Leslie. Mr. Nigel Romano, the representative of the Caribbean Development Bank. That's one of the perks of a person of my height. Those adjustments are oftentimes necessary. Director, United Nations Secretary General, Climate Change Support Team, Selwyn Hart. Distinguished panelists, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Green Climate Fund Board, specially invited guests, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On the behalf of the government of Barbados, let me start by welcoming everyone here tonight, especially those who are visiting for this occasion. I should also like to extend an apology and regrets for the Right Honourable Prime Minister of Barbados, Mr. Frundle Stewart, who is unable to be here, and on his behalf to thank the Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre, a regional institution which the Government of Barbados has supported since its inception, for the invitation to address you this evening. It's the 26th year of the existence of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are gathered to observe the fifth assessment report. And let me quote from the summary of the policymakers for the Working Group 1 report on physical science basis of climate change. I quote, "Warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over the decades. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentration of greenhouse gases have increased." Unquote. Working Group 2, in its report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, is even more alarming. According to the report, without additional efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, by the year 2100, the projections for the Caribbean region as a whole are as follows. Temperature rise to 1.4 degrees Celsius above present levels. Precipitation to decrease by 5%, and sea level to rise between 0.5 and 0.6 meters. Associated with these changes are the negative impacts such as coastal erosion, coral bleaching, loss of mangroves, saltwater intrusion of coastal aquifers, biodiversity lost, increased in the frequency of unusual heat extremes, and ocean acidification. This forecasts serious concerns for our agriculture, fisheries, health, and tourism sectors, and our very ability to grow a viable and sustainable economy. Earlier this year, CARICOM negotiators to the UNFCCC met in Trinidad and Tobago to discuss the Working Group reports. While they acknowledge Working Group 2's contribution to the fifth assessment report, they express regret that the special circumstances of small island developing states were not uniquely considered and presented despite the many requests made by Caribbean delegates to the IP meetings. Negotiators present at that meeting were particularly interested in the CARICOM-specific summary for policymakers that highlighted the special circumstances of CARICOM small island developing states and their vulnerability to global temperature increases of 1.5 to 2.0 degrees Celsius. This would strengthen our argument in the ongoing negotiations, further raise the profile of concern and requirement for urgent action across the region, and provide additional grounding for our efforts at building climate resilience and sustainable economies. In this regard, I call upon the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center to take the lead on this effort with the assistance of the IPCC. Working Group 3's report on mitigation highlights the risk to CARICOM countries for the continuing rise in greenhouse gas emissions and concluded that limiting temperature rise industrial levels to below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, as called for by the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, is still feasible. However, this can only be via ambitious mitigation actions by all if to ensure some level of meaningful existence for those most vulnerable to these adverse impacts of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, at a recently concluded United Nations Secretary General's Summit in New York, of national actions being undertaken across the world and ambitious greenhouse gas emission targets from many world leaders, as well as those being undertaken by multilateral and multi-stakeholder groups. From my own observation, the summit and the climate march were successful in elevating the discourse and the required response to the highest level of political and public consciousness. Perhaps now, compliance with stated actions will follow, as this is an absolute and urgent requirement for all nations if we are to faithfully pursue the goal of limiting the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees. Over the course of the next few days, Barbados will host the 8th meeting of the Green Climate Fund Board. Recognizing the importance and significance of this facility, I would also like to congratulate those who made pledges to the Climate Summit to capitalize the fund. From this region, the leaders of Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas and Barbados, among others, all made calls in their national statements for the immediate capitalization of the fund so that it can provide the required support that is desperately needed by the region and the entire Small Island Developing States fraternity. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to recognize the pledges made towards the Green Climate Fund at this Climate Summit by Germany, France, the Republic of Korea, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Mexico, Luxembourg, and the Czech Republic. The remaining countries which are yet to declare their contributions are urged to do so without further delay. As we look forward to COP20 in Lima, Peru later this year, I call upon all parties to the Climate Change Convention to take on board the findings of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report as you fine-tune your negotiations. This science is clear and has since the publication of the Fourth Assessment Report in 2007, if not earlier, demonstrated its accuracy. The future of the world that we approach COP21 in Paris next year with a positive, unified spirit and depart with an ambitious, legally binding global agreement that is fit for the purpose. It is a collective obligation that we simply cannot fail at achieving. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to applaud the hard work of the IPCC chair, working group co-chairs, and vice chairs, and the thousands of scientists who have contributed to the successful completion of the Fifth Assessment Report. It generations to wonder why we remain silent during the absent from the global dialogue when we had the opportunity to be otherwise engaged. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our responsibility as a member of the CARICOM community to continue to advance the importance of pursuing a climate-resilient development agenda for all CARICOM states. We therefore pledge our support for the agenda of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Ladies and gentlemen, there's much work ahead. There's much work to be done. And if this work is to be done, then it means all hands must be aboard. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention. Good night and God bless you.
We have heard from the Honorable Minister, and once again I ask you to join me once again for that address. Honorable Minister, as I said, we had two parts. You have fulfilled the third element. And I believe if we as a region and other leaders would follow through with what you have recommended, I think in the years to come, we will all be better off, especially to our younger generations. So I want to thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation and to have delivered such a wonderful address to the audience. At this time, as I said earlier, we are going to have the meeting in two parts. We have had the first session, and as an intermission, we would like to show you a short video of some of the work that the center has been involved with over the years and our region. But before I do that, I always like to use an opportunity to recognize some of our sister institutions, especially when they are present. And we have in the audience Dr. David Farrell. His institution, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, will continue to play a very important role if we are to address climate change and climate variability. You see, the center is involved with the long-term issues, the developmental issues, but we also have the operational side of things. And Dr. Farrell and his team is leading a new area in terms of climate. Just like we have meteorology departments and so on, we need to have the climate issues in the short term, medium term, and long term. So I would like for Dr. Farrell to stand so that you can all see who is leading that team. Dr. Farrell. As I said, he and his team are leading the operational side of climate management. Our coastal management, they can better plan for 3 months, 6 months, and hopefully very in the near future, 1 year in advance. So thanks again, Dave, for being here. So I will now call on technical people to show that short presentation on the work of climate change in our region and by the center.
Natural events and human activities contribute to an increase in average temperatures around the world. Increases in greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide is a main cause. Our planet and our region are warming. This is climate. Don't you know how climate change affects the Caribbean?
The Caribbean is a minute contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, but will be among the most severely impacted.
Experiencing its impacts, such as the 2013 rain in the Caribbean, such as carbon dioxide, is the main cause. Infrastructure to withstand more intense weather events, select crops that can thrive in extreme conditions and climate influence opportunistic pests and transform our planning frameworks to improve our resilience.
Climate change is a fossil energy related problem. Fossil fuel consumption costs the region US $37 million of its foreign exchange earnings yearly and further reduces the potential for economic growth. Renewable forms of energy will allow us to tackle problems: climate change and economic competitiveness.
Climate change projects have been underway in the Caribbean for nearly 2 decades. The early projects created a solid foundation for the work we do today.
Data collection and our ability to the region's climate in the future, conducted vulnerability analyses, and strengthen our efforts to include climate change into the national development process.
Less than a decade after its first climate change project, the region established the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, widely known as the 5 Cs, which executed the world's first pilot adaptation program in 3 countries across 5 areas. The climate proofing of the Martian Community Center in St. Lucia, the construction of a rainwater harvesting and wastewater recycling facility at Coconut Bay Beach Resort and Spa in Vieux-Fort, St. Lucia, the photovoltaic solar-powered saltwater reverse osmosis plant in Bequia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Our work is grounded in a firm regional commitment, policy, and strategy. Our 3 foundation documents, the Liliendahl Declaration, the Regional Framework for Achieving Development Resilient to Climate Change, and its accompanying implementation plan, are the basis for climate action in the Caribbean.
Guided by these actions, we've successfully executed a suite of regional climate change-related programs worth approximately $50 million US. These investments have been critical in advancing our resilience-building efforts and transforming attitudes.
Through meaningful relationships with complementary regional and international organizations and development partners. We're a partnership success story, and we're prepared to build on our successes.
To learn more about climate change, visit CaribbeanClimate.bz or the Clearinghouse, the most extensive repository of Caribbean-specific information on climate change.
Good day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tyrone Hall, our communication specialist. Mr. Hall and his team put that short video together in about a week's time. Short notice. I told him, I said, look, we need to have something to show. And working with his partners, he was able to put it together. So please join me in thanking Tyrone, a young, enthusiastic, and energetic person. Okay, at this time, we will move to the second session, and I would now like to invite the panelists to join us on the stage here. We have Dr. Nurse, Ms. Rye, Mr. Hart, Dr. Agard, would you join us here, since, as I said, you will be one for a resource person. I don't think we have what we wanted to do with Professor Fields from Stanford, but instead we'll show a short video that he made as a backup. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to tell you the role of each of the panelists. Dr. Nurse, like Dr. Agard, they have been involved with the IPCC since, as far as I can remember, its inception. And they have been playing leading roles in addressing issues of SIDS. As I said earlier, Dr. Nurse is not only a senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, but he has, and other team members, been producing one of the areas that we talked about earlier, capacity building. SURMEs have graduated over, as in my estimation, based on the numbers that came annually to do their fieldwork, at least 90 students. So among the developing countries and SIDS, I think we can be proud of the students they have produced in helping us to address climate change. We at the center have not only invited them to come to do their fieldwork, but we have used them as part of our team. We have had a number of the students working with us. So in the interest of time, I would like to introduce to you my colleague, my chairman, and one of the lead authors of the IPCC, Dr. Leonard Nurse.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols already observed, good evening. My strict marching orders by the chairman, 10 minutes he said, and maybe a little bit more. And my job is basically to share with you some of the findings of the fourth assessment report, but specifically in the chapter Islands, of which myself, I'm the coordinating lead author, and John was one of the lead authors. Basic background to the impacts that we'll talk about relate principally changes atmosphere in air temperature, surface air temperature. And what we've seen is regional increases in temperature, 1 to 4 degrees Celsius relative to the 1960 to 1990 mean. More hot days and extremely hot days, that is hot days defined as days on which the mean temperature is equal to or exceeds 30 degrees Celsius, extremely hot days equal to or exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. And these are mean temperatures, these are not maxima or minima. The mean temperatures are computed simply by adding the maximum and the minimum and dividing by 2. So when you're dealing with mean temperatures of this order of magnitude, we're talking about fairly significant increases. Also an increase in mean nighttime temperatures as well, so that nights are likely to become warmer. And in fact, based on the observed data, that has already begun. In relation specifically to sea surface temperatures, we've seen already, based on the observed data, decadal increases in the rates of warming. And our projections further show that we can expect even greater by the 3 time slices for the periods 2030 to 2059, 2070 to 2000 to 2029, 2030 to 2059, and 2070 to 2099 show successive decadal increases so that the rates are actually increasing. Moreover, I think what is also an interesting observation is that we're finding the range in temperatures, in mean monthly temperatures, are also reducing. In other words, what it means is that there will not be as great a differentiation between the hottest part of the year and the traditionally cooler part in terms of sea surface temperatures. This is not good for corals, which bleach easily. A very small excursion of temperature above seasonal maxima. In relation to observed and projected sea level rise, throughout the 20th century, sea levels have risen by between 1.3 to 1.7 millimeters per year since 1993, between 2.8 to 3.6 millimeters per year. This may seem quantitatively small, but such increases are really very important drivers of impacts at the coastal areas, because we have to superimpose sea level rise on other water level elements, such as water level anomalies, wave run-up, wave setup, and tidal changes. And when you superimpose those on each other, even quantitatively small changes of this range of magnitude become extremely significant. And in fact, you just can't add them together. They're not linear or arithmetic. Linear. So you get an exponential effect when you combine all of the impact of these elements together. There are, however, differences and marked regional variation. In the tropical Pacific, for example, the rate of rise is almost 4 times the global average. In the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, the rate is as much as twice the global average. And in the Caribbean, it has generally been similar to the global average, which is roughly 1.8 millimeters per year. Of course, this is absolute or eustatic sea level rise, as opposed to sea level rise. If I were 1.8 millimeters per year to a place like Guyana, Georgetown, the rate is actually 3 times that, because Georgetown is between 1.5 to almost 2 meters below mean sea level, and it is a subsiding coast. The impact then, relatively speaking, when you have subsidence occurring. Incidentally, driven by atmospheric increases in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, you're getting increases in CO2. Carbon dioxide levels in the ocean rose from 287 parts per million by volume in 1870, the point just after the Industrial Revolution, to about 390 parts per million by volume in 2013. And as of today's date, checking the NOAA and Mauna Loa data, parts per million, just under 400 parts per million. So it's increasing astronomically. What does this mean? It means that higher CO2 levels will drive higher ocean acidity, because risk to shell organisms, including corals, mollusks, shrimp, lobster, all the nice seafood that we are accustomed to, simply because it becomes difficult for them to calcify. So rates of calcification become reduced. And in fact, the IPCC projects, based on observed and projected data, that there will be between a 14 to 30% decline in the rate of calcification of shell organisms by about mid-century. And studies have shown, experimental studies in the laboratory have actually shown that at about 560 parts CO2, some corals will actually stop calcifying. They will basically cease growth. Rainfall projections for the Caribbean, and I think the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology are very well placed to speak more to this than I am. But what we do know is that when we look at all of the available data for the wider Caribbean, for the region, we see that between 1900 and 2000, a consistent decline by around 0.18 millimeters per year, coming from some recent research by some colleagues of the Climate Studies Group at Mona, by Michael Taylor and these groups. That is from the observed data. That's not a projection. That's actual data. In terms of projections, there's some variation. It is projected that the Northern Caribbean, that is north of about 22 degrees north, will experience increased rainfall towards the latter part of the wet season, whereas the Southern Caribbean, places like Barbados, will experience a contraction into the traditional wet season and likely experience longer dry seasons. The recent work of CIMH by Adrian Trotman and David Farrell and this group, I think is a significant step in the right direction in trying to explore this whole question of potential for longer and more intense droughts. But what are some of these impacts? Well, when you consider declining mean annual rainfall, more frequent and longer dry spells, higher temperatures and higher evaporation rates, saltwater intrusion into aquifers, and you superimpose that and add it to significant management failures and economic failures, as well as current and projected demand for available water supply, you have the perfect storm facing water resource managers in our regions, and even more so in countries which are already heavily water scarce. As indicated earlier, we can expect some significant health impacts as well. I'm just sort of cherry picking a few of them to highlight them here, as presented in the Small Islands chapter of the Fifth Assessment Report. But a higher incidence of vector-borne disease projected, dengue, fever, malaria, because the vectors themselves, as well as a number of the environmental transmission factors, are actually climate sensitive. They also project a risk of higher morbidity and mortality related to floods, storms, and in fact reduced fresh water, which will impact sanitation and hygiene. In some countries, I can speak specifically for the Pacific and many of the small islands, the increase in outbreaks of ciguatera, fish poisoning, is also increasing with elevated sea surface temperatures, and ciguatera occasionally outbreaks in the Caribbean as well. In terms of tourism, the effects will be direct as well as indirect. Direct, for example, through risks to critical infrastructure, most of which is coastal. Sea level rise also amplifies and storm surge elevations, leading to flooding, accelerated coastal erosion, and land loss. And also the loss of climate-sensitive attractions such as corals, which earn considerable revenues in our region. Incidentally, scuba diving is not a trivial pursuit. Scuba diving in the Dutch Antilles, Aruba, Bonaire, Sable, etc., in some years nets over $500 million in revenue. People literally leave where they live to go to the Dutch and the Netherlands Antilles for scuba diving alone. So it is not a trivial pursuit at all. What about food security? Well, if we think about some of the things that we've talked about before in relation to declining rainfall, soil salinization, and so on, we'll realize that a whole combination of factors are likely to be at play. Reduced rainfall, more drought events, higher soil and water salinity as a result of sea level rise. We also project a change in the range and variety of some crops and insects, as well as weeds, and damage to some critical fish habitat. We mentioned just in passing bleaching of corals, which is significant coral habitat, fish habitat. We have a very important regional coral reef fishery, but also mangroves and seagrasses and other marine organisms. So, without belaboring impacts which we are probably already familiar with, how will we configure and strategize to deal with adaptation? Well, we propose in the chapter that we need to step back from it a little bit and think about it, however, because there is always the temptation to believe that all adaptation strategies, particularly when you're dealing with small islands, are easily transferable from one locality to another. In our review of the literature, we've seen very clearly, or even communities with, or even among the SID regions. So there are a number of adaptation strategies that have been practiced and implemented in the Pacific SIDS region and in the Indian Ocean SIDS region, which I would not recommend necessarily in our region, dealing with entirely different systems, both biophysical as well as cultural and so on. So that we would argue, useful guidance, we must always ensure that the lessons are appropriate in our economic, social, and cultural circumstances. And therefore, what we suggest is that individual countries must conduct risk profiles, an assessment of their particular risk profile, because that will help to ensure context-specific investments in relation to the scarce resources which people like Selwyn are trying to garner for us, and we want to spend those investments on mitigation and adaptation effectively. But it is not necessarily an easy road, because a review of our work in preparing for the fourth assessment report, a number of challenges, and I've just pulled one out, because it is simple, it is ordinary, but it exists, and it can be a stumbling block. The whole question of determining how conducive the environment is for taking timely adaptation action, with the way we perceive the threat. Some people still argue to this day that climates have always changed, which is quite true. I'd be the first to argue that. Climates have always changed in the past. So on that basis, we still have a number of constituencies saying, well, as a consequence, this is a temporary aberration, and this too will pass. We still encounter people who speak of the fact that a lot of the science is unproven, it is imagined, it is not real, and that climate change is a challenge that we don't even have to bother about right now, because it will confront us in the future. And in any event, we have more pressing issues right now, like education and housing and things like that. So why worry about something which is going to confront us in the future? The problem with that is that that kind of thinking leads us to short-term fixes. And short-term fixes tend to amplify exposure and risk and vulnerability, and often can lead inappropriate adaptation choices. And that's one of the challenges in which I think, notwithstanding the great strides I think the region has made, I think that we still have that battle to fight. The challenge has to do with the sometimes misplaced perception that small islands are all similar, so you can use a broad brush and apply adaptation. But biophysically, geologically, topographically, they're vastly different. I have 6 panels there from the small islands chapter there, showing different island typologies, 6 of them, raised volcanic islands to atolls to raised limestone islands and so on. You also have islands that are still emerging crustally from the ocean, like Barbados, for example, slowly. And you also have some that are subsiding. So there's a variety of things happening that adds to the heterogeneity of island systems. But when you superimpose on all this differing social, economic, political, and cultural systems, and different value systems and beliefs, it means that you have to think very carefully about borrowing approaches without seriously evaluating their potential location-specific effectiveness. So this is why I argued earlier that adaptation strategies are not always transferable, and that the lessons learned are not always easily applied from one location or one community to the other. In summary, what I want to make clear is that we in the IPCC have never claimed certainty in anything we do. In fact, we acknowledge, and this is what we use very carefully, if you read reports, the language is couched very carefully into likely, very likely, unlikely, etc., but those are not used in layman terms. Every term we use, like likely, very likely, unlikely, etc., has a probability value attached based on our work. So you need to understand what it means in terms of the likelihood of the event occurring. One of the frequent arguments is that there's still too much uncertainty in the climate models. I will say clearly there is uncertainty, but like I argue here, not a disability that afflicts climate models only. In fact, they affect all other models, including, with apologies to my economist friends, economic models. And we seem to have a lot of great confidence in that. Not to Selwyn, But you don't know what future oil prices will be from day to day, but we put money in your hands and tell you, and we believe it. But you don't believe the scientific models because of the uncertainty. We argue, finally, as well, that delaying adaptation until there's absolute certainty is clearly ill-advised, because we have access to a variety of risk management strategies, including no-regret options that can build resistance. In fact, they're good, sensible, prudent strategies and options we can use, whether or not climate change is real, or whether or not it exists. So there's no need to delay action responses simply because of lack of quote unquote perfect knowledge. We are clear that climate change will exacerbate existing challenges as well as trigger some new ones. And this is what we try to focus on in the report, the level of change and exacerbation that can potentially occur among, with respect to those currently faced, but there are also some new and like ocean acidification, which we previously didn't consider to be critical at all. And finally, in the document, without going into any of the options or strategies, it is clear, based on our review of the adaptation strategies and plans implemented in many parts of the world, and there have been some very good plans implemented in the Pacific and parts of the Indian Ocean. When we review these, it is clear that effective adaptation requires not a single option approach, but a broad suite of policy interventions that range from the technological to the fiscal to the legal and the administrative. And that is where I leave you, because I just want to broadly give you some sense as to some of the key findings in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nurse, for giving us that overview of some of the clear issues we are faced with. Before calling on the next speaker, I would like to say something and bring it to your attention. The first assessment report, as was mentioned, was published in 1990. That is 24 years ago. Therefore, it is noteworthy that at that time of the issuance of the first report, almost 50% of our population as exists today was not yet conceived. This highlights the importance of events such as one to inform, especially the population, of the importance of the IPCC reports. Think about it. Almost 50% of our current population in the region was not yet conceived. In fact, in some countries, it is even higher than 50%. So it is something that we need to take into account. And I would like to highlight two other things in terms of since the AR5 came out, whilst they were writing. As of May 2013, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere exceeded 400 parts per million, Dr. Nurse. And this was measured. In fact, as we stand right now, it is in excess of 400 parts per million. In October 2013, an article in Nature stated that by 2047, the global climate will enter a state never seen before. It will be outside the bounds of historical variability and short-term extremes. The study further shows that lower latitudes, such as that of the Caribbean, will be first to experience the change some 15 years earlier, We are now approaching 2015. If you add 15 years to that, simple arithmetic, 2030. So we don't have much time. So even though the higher latitudes have a little bit more time, we in the Caribbean and our sister regions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, we have to think seriously. And Honorable Minister, this is where policymakers have to give serious concerns in terms of what we do in the next 15 years and how we work to get the industrialized countries to understand the predicament facing us. With that, Mr. Leon Charles is in house, is he? Yes. He will give us some highlights in terms of what the AR5 means. Mr. Leon Charles.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Leslie, and good evening in the audience here tonight. Let me begin by making an apology for joining you late, but I come from Grenada, and today we accept the uncertainty that surrounds this question of climate variability and climate change as we know it. I don't know how many of you are aware that there is a hurricane up north, Antigua, St. Kitts, Anguilla, and the entire LIAT system up north has been disrupted. And as such, the flight which was supposed to leave Grenada at 12:20 actually left around 4:30. So in fact, I've just come in, and therefore I hope you'll excuse my not being here for the start of this activity. I've been asked this evening to speak a little bit about the linkage between the IPCC reports and national climate change negotiations. And I think it's an issue which we could address at two levels, really. One being the mandate of the IPCC, and the other one being the content of the report, because there is a linkage at both levels in terms of how the IPCC reports play into the negotiations. For those of you who are not familiar with the negotiations, what we're trying to do in the negotiations essentially are two things in simple layman's terms. One is to arrest the growth of greenhouse gas emissions to a level that is safe and would not cause many of the disruptions which Dr. Nuss was talking about. And the second one is to recognize the fact that countries do not have the resources and the capabilities to be able to cope even with the minimal impacts from climate change. And therefore, we're also trying to build a regime that will provide support to these vulnerable countries, many of them SIDS, LDC, other developing countries. And you will appreciate that both of these objectives, in fact, have a scientific underpinning. And the first major role of the IPCC, and in fact the IPCC's mandate, is to provide the scientific information policy decisions are made. It's as simple as that. And when the IPCC was formed in 1988, 1989, it was in fact given the to synthesize the existing science so that the United Nations could make a decision as to how we approach based on this. And if you track the IPCC reports over the years, you will see that each of the reports, in fact, played a fundamental role in moving the climate regime forward. For example, the first assessment report in 1990, in fact, made a strong recommendation that an international convention was required to address climate change. And out of that, we got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. The second assessment report in 1995, again, advised on the need for a legally binding agreement. And out of that, we got the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The third assessment report, in fact, 2001, and it was timed to coincide with the coming into force of the Kyoto Protocol around 2003. And then the fourth assessment report in 2007 came out just as the negotiations started for the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. So historically, each of the reports have in fact served to inform major steps forward in the climate regime and in the negotiations. And this fifth assessment report is no exception, because in fact the mandate for the negotiations which are currently underway, which we hope to conclude by next December with a new legally binding agreement, one of the mandates is that the new agreement should be informed by the latest science, including, among other things, the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we have a clear mandate that the IPCC is going to provide the foundation, the scientific foundation, from which we're going to work with in the negotiations. And therefore, as negotiators, we cannot, in fact, ignore it. This is not to say that it's the only scientific report that is going to be used. I mean, there are other reports that are available. IPCC has cutoff dates, and there's a lot of other information that have come since the IPCC cutoff dates, which we want to bring into the negotiations. So it is not this only scientific input that we're going to be using. It is the foundation, and for many negotiators, it is in fact the authoritative source of scientific information. So I think that's the first point. It influences the science that goes into the negotiating process. So that therefore raises the question on the content. What does the content tell us that would be useful or would influence the outcome of the negotiations? And how does that relate to what we as CARICOM negotiators are striving for in the negotiations? And I suggest that there are 5 broad areas, 5 broad messages from the IPCC report that are of relevance to the negotiations. The first one is that we have a problem with greenhouse emissions, an urgent problem that needs to be addressed. I think the IPCC Working Group 1 and Working Group 3 have documented that the rate of increase of greenhouse gas emissions is at its highest in history. And it has also documented that if we want to keep the emissions within the established safe levels of below 2 degrees Celsius, we in fact have only 6 years before we exceed the carbon budget under the business as usual scenarios. Basically, to stay under 2 degrees, we need to have somewhere around 880 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. Currently, we have 531. We're increasing at about 40 to 45 per year. So if you work it out, the difference gives us 6 years. If we do not arrive in 6 years, we cannot keep the temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius, or what we're asking for. And 1.52 degrees is a very significant threshold in terms of the impacts you have from climate change. The IPCC has something it calls reasons for concern. I don't know if Leonard showed you those charts, where it has thresholds of what happens at 1.5, 2, 3. And you see that once you move beyond 2, a lot of impacts increase significantly. So the first message from the report is that this is an urgent, and therefore we need to take action urgently. And therefore that translates into the negotiation in terms of the need for higher levels of mitigation reduction within a short period of time, 2025, 2030. So that's the first message. The second one, though, and one that I think is extremely important and we do not hear too much about, is that the solutions to keeping the emissions within manageable levels are both technically and economically feasible. The IPCC stresses that. It's technically feasible because the technologies for energy efficiency, for energy and this for reduction in deforestation and so on already exist and are being implemented. That has been documented not just by the IPCC, it's been documented by the UNEP in annual gap reports for the last 2 or 3 years. And last week, it was all documented by a major economic report called the New Climate Economy, which was submitted to Ban Ki-moon's summit at the United Nations. So it's technically feasible. We have the technologies to do it if we get the political will to deploy those technologies. It's also economically feasible. The IPCC has calculated that the cost in GDP of implementing those technically feasible solutions are less than 2% of global GDP out to 2050. With annual GDP growth of between 3 and 4%, you're still at a net benefit by implementing these solutions. So saying that it's going to wreck the global economy, that is not true. What is true is that it's winners and there will be losers. There will be sectors that will have to be phased out and people will lose jobs. For example, we must decarbonize by 2050. If we decarbonize by 2050, it means we stop using coal. If we stop using coal, it means the countries and the states that benefit from coal will lose. But it also means we'll have to get into more renewable energy and more energy efficiency, more solar power, and the countries and states that invest in these are going to win, like China is winning right now with the solar energy question. So yes, there will be winners and losers, but the challenge is not to take no action. The challenge is to find a way to bring the losers along, to help the losers and to transit to the new economy and move along with the new economy, which is something, for example, you hear President Barack Obama talking about quite a lot. But the point is, it is technically and economically feasible to address the problem of climate change based on what the IPCC has told us. The third important point, and that comes from the Working Group 3, is that the solutions require cooperative action. No one country alone can solve the climate change problem. The reason is simple, it's a transboundary issue. The emissions in Barbados don't affect Barbados only, it affects the United States, it affects Russia, it affects everybody else. So you can't put up a wall and say, okay, if I put up this wall, no emissions are going to affect me, therefore I wouldn't have any climate change. It's a global problem and it requires a global solution. And a global solution therefore requires that all countries work together cooperatively. No one country could solve the problem. And that comes from the Working Group 3 report in terms of what are the options for addressing climate change. The fourth point that is specific to SIDS is that SIDS are disproportionately affected, small island states. And in fact, it makes the point that the costs of coping with the impacts on small islands, all the various slides you saw Dr. Nuss going through a few minutes ago, those impacts, the costs far exceed the resources of these small island states. So we're faced with a challenge where we haven't created a problem, we have a significant impact, significant loss. Grenada in 2004, we had Hurricane Ivan, 200% of our GDP lost in 4 hours. We had to rebuild the entire country, 90% of our buildings destroyed. Where would the money come from to rebuild that? Even though we haven't rebuilt all our buildings yet. Those costs are far in excess of our resources. And therefore, what we have to do to be able to solve the problem is to find a way to provide support to those countries which are experiencing those costs. And then the fifth point which the IPCC makes is that SIDS lack the in-house capacity and constraints, and have constraints and lack resources to be able to cope with problems. So these are 5 messages from the IPCC reports are very relevant to the negotiations. I can go into more detail on others if you want to get into a Q&A later on. But essentially, there is a problem. The problem is solvable, technically and economically. The solutions require action. SIDS are affected and lack capacity and therefore need support. Going to the negotiations, our negotiating framework responds to those kinds of findings from the IPCC. And from the CARICOM perspective, there are 5 broad themes which we negotiate on. One is that we need very ambitious action on reducing greenhouse gases. We have to take action by 2030 to turn the curve from moving up to moving down. We have to, I'm trying to avoid the technical language, you have to peak and decline in terms of the trajectory of the emissions. If we don't do that, we'll exceed the carbon budget and we'll lose the opportunity to get to 2 degrees. So ambitious mitigation reduction targets is a number 1 priority in the negotiations. Secondly, we need for funding for adaptation and mitigation actions, especially within the small island states. We need support for adaptation. And I'm very pleased today to see that the Green Climate Fund is actually meeting here. So you'll actually experience what it's like to be in a small island state and see some of the challenges we deal with. And I think that some of the measures we have already seen in the Green Climate Fund are very relevant in terms of, for example, allocating certain proportions of the for adaptation. However, what's going to be important is not just what proportion you allocate, you have to allocate from in the first case. because I have the experience of other funds like the Special Climate Change Fund and so on, where they're 100% for adaptation, but they have no money. So it's one thing to have a fund, it's another thing to have resources. And what we need are resources, not a proliferation of funds that are empty vessels. But so that's one of the things we're negotiating, not just that we have the fund, but that the funds are adequately resourced. The third one is the whole question of adaptation has limits, and that's a point which also came in this report, that there are certain things you cannot adapt to. For example, and this limits means that we have to start to consider what we refer to in the negotiations as loss and damage. No matter what you do, there are going to be losses. And those losses have to also be addressed as part of the negotiating framework. Then we have to recognize the special circumstances of small island developing states and the fact that we have capacity constraints, and therefore the kind of requirements that we're asked to undertake would have to be reflective of our capacity to undertake these. And then to ensure that we do what we say we're going to do, that we all join and make a genuine effort, the agreement has to be legally binding. So these are some of the broad themes on which the CARICOM negotiations have been conducted. And a lot of it, as I see, is underpinned by the scientific findings of the IPCC as we try to deal with the question of how do we arrest the growth in greenhouse gases and how do we help small, vulnerable developing countries cope of climate change. So with this brief few words, I'm told I had 5 minutes. I guess I've gone over it. I hope I have just covered it quickly, and I'll be available to answer any questions if you want to go into more detail on the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leon. As I said at the beginning, we want the audience to participate. And after 2 hours, we have already exceeded 1.5. So we don't have more time. I had hoped to have 40 minutes. So I will ask the other speakers to try to stick within the time frame. I will now call on Ms. Rai to talk from civil society's point of view, and in her case, cross. Thank you.
With all protocol duly observed, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I think I was just asked to cut out all the juicy parts of my presentation. This evening, I'm privileged to represent the Red Cross Red Crescent movement and to share with you some of our perspectives on the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. This latest report from the IPCC is not just a scientific assessment. Its careful wording reflects an increased emphasis on risk, the risk we face today, and the type of choices that we will need to make in the future. From this sober scientific assessment, several stark humanitarian messages emerge. The first is the strong confirmation that we are already facing rising risks. This is a message that has long been clear to the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent movements and its millions of volunteers worldwide, who have been the first-hand witnesses of how climate change has increased disaster risk for millions of vulnerable people, compromising their ability to sustain their sources of livelihood. Climate change also poses formidable challenges to the humanitarian community also. There are implications on our ability to respond to the mounting risks today and in the years ahead. However, the second message emerging from the report is a bit more positive. Immense capacities do exist to address these rising risks. Capacities which can be even more effective when applied with awareness and investment ahead of potential problems. Again, this report is only an echo of what we're experiencing. It's less about capacities and more about how the resources are shared or spread across the different levels. Through our experience working alongside communities, we found that the first line of defense for vulnerable communities in many risk-prone countries is preparedness and greater resilience. Enhanced action on adaptation is needed to help avert or reduce the worst humanitarian impacts of climate change. The involvement of local communities is essential. Two examples of this in the Caribbean can be found in Jamaica and in Grenada. Communities have been engaged in identifying their risk and increase their resilience. In Jamaica, the communities looked towards slope stabilization, while in Grenada, they looked at ecosystem adaptation. The third message in this report is about our choices for the future. Past greenhouse gas emissions have already committed us to rise in risk for several years. The report shows that we can largely handle these now inevitable changes. For the second half of the century, however, we face a bigger choice, one that needs to be made now. If and only if the greenhouse gas emissions are cut drastically and soon, we'll be able to continue to manage the impacts. If, on the other hand, emissions continue at present rate, we'll be reaching the limits of adaptation in more and more places, and the humanitarian consequences will be dire. Humanitarian agencies have a small part to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For our part, in the Caribbean, the International Federation of Red Crosses partner with the Association of American States, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross Society to initiate a feasibility study on how we can make our emergency operations a little more and reducing our carbon footprint. In fact, earlier this year, we published our evaluation of our largest humanitarian response operation in the Caribbean to the Haiti earthquake, where we examined and evaluated how we can make our operations a bit more greener. All of these choices bring us to a fourth humanitarian message, one that is perhaps a little less explicit in the report. Now that the IPCC has spoken, many others have to take this information into the world through a wide range of places, sectors, and people. We must ensure that the information on risk finds its way to those who need it most, especially vulnerable groups directly affected, so that local knowledge can be combined with the best available science. We must also ensure that an even wider audience is aware of the big choices ahead, about how we address risks that are rising now and the even bigger ones that we can still avoid. For this reason, we will need to communicate in simple and clearer terms, not only to the scientists and global policymakers, but in businesses, in schools, in our communities and neighborhoods, through hard data and facts, but also through storytelling, animations, and even games. For us, this report confirms that we have no choice but to adapt to climate change. Enhanced actions, concrete investments in community resilience, and continued engagement with governments and partners are all the consequences. The Red Cross movement will continue to work with communities to strengthen their ability to address the challenges of climate change, with a particular focus on disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, food security, and livelihoods. For us, climate change is real and is here. The scientific data is extremely important, but what is now key is how we take that information and rethink the way we work. Thank you. I hope that was within 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for that, Miss Rai. I have one more presentation that will come from Professor Field from Stanford. This will be a video because of the lateness, he was not able to make a live presentation. So, Tyron, are we ready?
Good day. I'm one of two co-chairs of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's designed to provide definitive assessments of what we know and what we don't know about climate change science. In Working Group 2, we focus on change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, looking both at climate changes that have already occurred and risks of climate changes moving forward. Every IPCC report is a really remarkable achievement. It reflects in many ways the distillation of the work of the entire community. The real work, the effort of the hundreds of lead authors who work over several years to read all of the literature relevant to climate change impacts adaptation and vulnerability for regions and sectors around the world, and distill that into a series of key findings that are relevant to policy but not prescriptive of particular policies. In the most recent version of the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC, authors dealt with 30 chapters that range from how to make decisions under uncertainty to the impacts on particular sectors, things like food security or economic impacts. And they also looked at a wide regions, including, especially important for you, chapter on Smile Island nations. You'll have a chance to hear a lot about the contents of the report and the findings. I want to emphasize just one element. A new feature of the framing of the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC is the recognition that the challenge of dealing with a changing climate is really a challenge in managing and reducing risks. When you look around society, you see lots of sophisticated tools that are already widely deployed for risk management. So the challenge of managing change is fundamentally different. It adds new dimensions, it adds new complications, problems, functioning very much like a threat multiplier. But the fact that climate change is a threat multiplier means that many of the tools, many of the strategies that we already have in place and have experience with can be deployed to effectively manage climate change if our ambition matches the magnitude of the task. My feeling is that the Working Group 2 contribution to the most recent report provides a very solid foundation for understanding and for understanding the elements that need to go into providing the solutions that can build robust and vibrant communities. Thanks very much, and I wish you the very best with your workshop today.
That came from Professor Field at Stanford University. He had agreed to do a live broadcast, but unfortunately, because of our late, the window was no longer available. But he had a backup plan, and this is what we need in terms of our adaptation efforts. Make sure we have a plan with alternatives. If one doesn't work, we have something else. So that backup plan is a good example where he provided us with a video that we could have used. So once again, even though he is not here, I would like to applaud Professor Fields. As I said earlier, I always feel that the success of any meetings or workshop is where you have the audience participating, and therefore I will invite the panelists to come back on stage, including Dr. Agard, Prof. Agard, because as I said, he is one of our key people in terms of the IPCC, and because of time we didn't want to overburden the panelists, but I would like him to be back here because he can add quite a bit that you have not yet heard from the panelists. So please come up, and I would like to invite you to have your questions, but be as precise and concise as possible so that we can get as many of you involved in the questioning of our panelists, and therefore get a broader understanding of the importance of the report. So panelists, would you join us? And I would like to have some help up here. Dr. Bino, could you come so that can help in terms of directing the people? I think I saw Dr. Trotzer earlier. Oh, yes. I like to make sure that the staff of the 5Cs are always involved. And this is no surprise to them. So any questions, please. We'll have microphones taken to you, I think. Okay, we have the first question at the back. Can we get a microphone? at the top.
Hi, good night. Jamila Seeley of the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. I would like to know what can we do at the national level to change people's perspectives about climate change, not only international but at the regional. Okay.
Okay, that is a general question, and therefore I will invite each of the panelists who would like to answer that to proceed. Do you want a number of questions? Okay, it is recommended that we take a number of questions, so we'll go with 5 questions and then proceed from there.
Yeah, my name is Grafton Cobham, and I want to address the question. This is Selwyn Hart, right? He might not be on the panel, but he mentioned something about Green Global Fund that would become available in the next months. And then another speaker, I think the second last speaker, Mills, he said that yes, there are a lot of funds around, but the funds have only promises in them. So that's my, are these funds do the funds have already cash in them that is available? If I have a small hotel somewhere near the sea, can I access these funds or just promises in the fund? Second question I want to address is one related to a statement made that there will be losers and there will be winners in this in the era of climate change. So if you're in the coal, then you would be a loser, but if you're in solar energy, you would be a winner. And that you need to bring the losers around. But I'm saying the losers will lose because if they're not, we're not here to bring the losers around. They need to get on board in new technology, and the people will decide who the winners.
Any other question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, good evening. I'm Ian Book from the delegation in the US here in Barbados and to the Eastern Caribbean. Just by chance, I picked up an email about climate change that came from my colleagues in Brussels with some key EU messages for reference. Now, I won't bore you all with all of them because we'll have the right forum to do that another time, but I would just like to say that the EU is going to be ready to table its contribution to the new 2015 climate agreement by the first quarter of 2015, i.e. very soon. And we're, of course, also rather hopeful that other major emitters will be ready to do the same quite soon also. So that's one key message about what the EU is doing concretely. Also, we very much share, I think, and that's well accepted, the negotiating objectives of the SIDS grouping and the OSIS grouping, most significantly to get a legally binding agreement next year. So we will be working very closely together to ensure that. And that was a rather long, waffly introduction. I'll get to the main point. I've attended quite a number of this kind of sessions, and I'm amazed and a little unsettled by the fact that I haven't heard the word mainstreaming yet. I was a bit of a mainstreaming practitioner myself in a previous posting, and a lot of people smile and laugh, and my colleague here is doing the same. But I think it is absolutely essential, and you haven't spoken much about what are doing to mainstream climate change, most notably because I think to make optimal use of scarce resources, you have to make sure that your budgeting process really addresses climate change adaptation in a rather structured, centralized manner, or which countries in the region are good examples of mainstreaming. Also because I think to access evidence and transparency to be able to get the funds and then to report on what you've used them for subsequently. And as a bit of a sort of a naughty devil's advocate question, fully agree that we all need to decarbonize our economies. So I'd like to hear your perspectives on countries in the region that are adopting coal as part of their energy mix in the very near future, and also the possibility of natural gas even increasing its share of the regional energy mix? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your and also the questions in terms of what in mainstreaming. If I don't hear the appropriate answer from the panelists, I think I will call on my colleagues from the center to give you an idea of how the region, what we are doing in terms of mainstreaming, what we prefer to use the word integrating into the system. Because mainstreaming, in my opinion, is like doing what you're doing, but just put climate change in, whereas we need to integrate rather than just mainstream. Any other question at this point?
Thank you. A very practical one. If the organizations represented could just share how they are implementing the very things of which you're speaking. For example, I was so pleased to see the electronic travel rather than the physical travel, because one of the greatest hypocrisies is to floating tons of carbon on the way to conferences about their impact, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So I'm very, very excited when people can say what they are doing and not just saying in that example, whether it's moving away from physical buildings, since they represent about 1/3 of the problem, and moving away from physical travel, since that.
Thank you again for that observation. And I should tell you that one of the things we are doing in the region to reduce travel, both from a budgetary point of view, is to do video conferencing and other means of using the technology. So that was an example where our colleague from Stanford was doing this presentation using current technology. I think we have 5 questions at this point in time. So Leon, would you want to be the first to start?
Check. Okay, thanks very much. Check. I'll try to address 3 of the questions that came. One on the question of the funds, well fund, and do we have cash in the funds? I think I'm the one who made the comment. There is an international climate finance architecture that has a number of different sources of funding at this point. We have the Global Environment Facility, which funds some aspects of climate change, commonly known as the GEF. We have a number of funding windows under the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. We have one called the Special Climate Fund. We have the LDC Fund, and we have the Adaptation Fund. Then if we go across to the World Bank has the Climate Investment Funds, and then a number of regional banks and so have their own individual funding. The challenge we've had is that funding has really not been very significant in terms of being sufficient for the needs that have been addressed. And the Special Climate Change Fund, for example, have been in existence since 2001. That's what, 14 years? And has only been able to accumulate pledges of $330 million, which really has not been able to do very much. The GEF has not been able to do much for adaptation projects because of limitations it has had. The Adaptation Fund depends on the carbon market, and because the price of carbon credits, and I don't want to get into too much technicalities right now, because the price of carbon credits fell after the Copenhagen conference failed, the Adaptation Fund doesn't have much money now. In fact, last year it had to beg for pledges from countries, and they got around $100 million in pledges. So the point, first of all, is that the existing funds really are very under-resourced. And the Green Climate Fund was set up in an attempt to overcome this problem by having a major fund dedicated to climate. The Green Climate Fund is now in the process of being operationalized, and countries are going through a process of pledging funds. And the target which has been raised by some countries for the pledging is that we should have between $10 and $15 billion pledged by December of this year. To date, we have about $2.5 billion pledged. So it was in that context that the point was being made, that we need to have sufficient funds pledged for these funds to really be able to make a significant difference. And to date, we have not sufficiency of funds being pledged. So that one of the emphases in the negotiations is in fact to try to get countries to be able to pledge sufficient funds. We have a point of reference we're working from in Copenhagen in 2009. The developed countries committed to providing $100 billion per year by 2020. So one of the things we're negotiating is to move from the current to get to $100 billion by 2020. Do we simply until 2020 and hope they provide $100 billion, or do we begin to scale up so that we get to $20 billion over time with a trajectory? So all these are some of the issues that's involved. But the Green Climate Fund is up and running. The Green Climate Fund is now meeting this week to finalize a lot of its operational procedures. There has been monies pledged to $2.5 billion to date, and we're hoping that there's going to be a major pledging conference scheduled for November, when a number of countries have said they will pledge, and the hope is that we'll get to the $10 billion mark by then. So that's the situation with the funding into something that's meaningful and adequate for the challenge which we're faced with. In terms of the comment on winners and losers, yes, I used a black and white example because we're trying to make the point, but a lot more nuance than that. For example, I don't think that you will see coal, for example, being completely wiped out. There is new technology being experimented with called carbon capture and storage to capture the emissions from the coal before it gets into the atmosphere and to bury it. And if that is successful, it obviously will give life to a more highly technologically approach to how you mine coal and use coal and so on. But even that is going to require a different set of skills than simply going and dig the coal off the ground. So the point I was making is that there are going to be transitions to move to a low carbon economy. There are going to be transitions as we try to get the technologies and it's a fact of life we have to live with. But it doesn't mean that we'll completely wipe out some or others, but they will be transformed and we'll approach them and use them differently. On the question of mainstreaming, I know Dr. Leslie wants me to comment on that, but the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center has developed a methodology for helping to assess the climate sensitivity of their investments and to use that methodology to decide how best to respond to make it climate sensitive. It's something called sea coral.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard the term, but it's a phrase we should get familiar with because it's a very good tool, and if in fact climate change at any operational level, we will come in contact with sea coral. I can tell you that in Green we have begun working on sea coral. We have received training from the Climate Change Center in terms of how to use the tool. They've trained the trainers, and the trainers are now engaged in training people at the sectoral level. So we're trying to roll out this whole climate sensitivity so that as we look at existing investments or we look at new investments, we test them for the climate sensitivity. And if the climate sensitivity crosses a certain threshold, we in fact will build in a climate resilience framework into those projects to ensure that the climate risks are managed upfront rather than we have them being exposed to climate change. And it is not something you just do overnight. It's a process where you have to train people. People have to become accustomed with the tool, become accustomed to doing vulnerability analysis, and become accustomed understanding what a climate risk and how to mitigate climate risk. And therefore, it's something which I think is going to take a number of years to become fully embedded. But countries have started, and I can attest that in Grenada, we actually have started, and it's something that people are receiving in a very positive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say it is not only in Grenada. We have gone through Suriname. In fact, the team just completed Jamaica and others. At this time, I would like to ask Professor Agard if he has anything to say in terms of what was asked or other contributions you can make at this point in time, because, as I said, you're a part of the IPCC, so I'd appreciate it if you can give your views.
Thank you very much, Chair. The science part of climate change, I think, that point is taken. Where we are at now is really on the adaptation part and the mitigation part, what to do. Has to be brought down from the global level. It's great to talk about, IPCC thinking at a larger level, and migrate that down to the Caribbean and then to specific places where people live. So a lot of that effort is, how is this going to affect people? Because that is part of increasing the knowledge and getting the groundswell of support from people, because most people are concerned about how is it going to affect them, although it's a global problem. So it's very important to look at the specific measures taken by countries. That would come down to getting past mere changes in policy, but to actions down on the ground. People in the Caribbean are now very much aware of increased frequencies of extreme events, and you've heard some of those examples. And there are two aspects that we need to bear in mind. One is the physical impact of climate change. A lot about that from Dr. Nurse. But a very important aspect, which is not as precise, is the cost of inaction, of not taking measures, and how that increases vulnerability. So if I give you an example, if there was a hurricane of category 5 that hit Barbados, that hit Haiti, the consequences would be quite different. They have not enforced the building codes. They have no building codes, actually. They have no construction standards of any kind. So the actual damage done is a lot greater than in Barbados, where there has been enforcement of building codes and so on. That's that it's not merely about the physical impact of the climate signal, because it's a lot worse if you don't do anything. If you take measures, you can reduce vulnerability. I think that's an important idea to get across. And the longer you take before you take action, the cost increases. So as years pass, it will take up an increasing percentage of your GDP to deal with issues that would have been cheaper to deal with today. So, taking measures now, specific measures, like things like, enforcement codes. There was just a study done in Trinidad, Economics of Climate Change Adaptation, where many economists were involved, and they looked at the benefit to cost ratios of a whole long range of measures. And many people were surprised that some of the cheapest measures, like replanting mangroves instead of building seawalls, for example, or enforcing building codes, things that were intuitively taught all along, are not expensive. There's no reason why we can't, initiate those things. It doesn't require hundreds of millions of dollars. These are important lessons. There are a lot of things we do now.
Very much. I would like to comment on that, but in the interest of time, I will ask Dr. Nurse to address the questions raised and any other remarks.
I'm not sure that I can answer any of them. They're really tough questions. The first question...
That's why you're a professor, sir.
The first question had to do with the issue of changing people's perception. How do you do that? I wish I knew myself. My understanding is that achieving and reinforcing positive behaviors and desirable behaviors is a very serious specialty. And I have no such expertise or training. But what I would say, though, is that at the very basic level, the number of things that one can do as a community, whether it's a small group, at the national level, at the regional level, or even an institution, and that is engage genuine engagement with people, all kinds of stakeholders, public engagement, as well as demonstrating that things do work, so that we don't only in academic and scientific terms, but demonstrate to the extent possible how some of the actions we propose can actually work. And where there are successes, share those successes and speak to the circumstances under which strategies work and the circumstances under which they do not work. And I think it is not a single quick fix. It's not one thing you can do, but it has to be done by a combination of things. The other point I want to make in relation to that question is that my understanding is that changing people's behavior and perceptions and so on takes an inordinate period of time and sometimes a lifetime. And it can only be considered a work in progress. It is not easy. For example, to use a personal anecdote, when our two children were growing up, and they're now 2, their mother, more so than I did, consistently, I can still hear her voice in my ears ringing out, shouting at them, "Close the tap while you're brushing your teeth." And now it is like breathing out and breathing out and breathing into them as adults because they don't do it. But they're now 34 years old and 29. So it takes, that's 3 decades that we're talking about, but it worked. So my point is that you have to begin and continue reinforcing it. And I know of no other way of doing it. But I also want to add something to the question that Leon raised about winners and losers. I think that the notion of winners and losers under climate change cannot be assessed in a very broad, general way. I think that we have to attach some time scales to winning and losing. And let me give you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about. Going back to the third assessment report, we pointed out, for example, that in relation to crop yields, the difference between yields and C4 crops, those which can benefit from CO2 fertilization as opposed to those which will not benefit, will show, the C3 plants will show higher yields. That is not going to happen in perpetuity. The projections show that when you look at wheat, for example, and some of the northern cereals, they will benefit maybe up to the 2050s, 2060s decades, but thereafter the yields decline as well. So the notion of time scales is important. More recently, some of the work coming out of the Pacific on the migration of some tuna stocks, skipjack tuna, and so on. There's some work that suggests the losers will likely be some of the Pacific SID, but the winners could easily be Australia and New Zealand based on some migrant. But again, that is not going to happen forever, because once you reach certain thresholds of temperature change, then you're going to get depletion of migration. So I just want to add that because I think you have to contextualize the thinking in relation to losers and winners.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nurse, for highlighting that aspect. As I said, tonight we don't have enough time because there are areas we could readily expand. However, I will now ask Ms. Wright to give you her aspect, her prospects in terms of the questions asked and any other expansions you'd like to make on her presentation.
Thank you. I'd just like to reinforce and add to what was said with regards to change in minds and perception. In addition to everything that was said before, one of the like to share with everyone is the importance of connection in our communities today, where we're forming new neighborhoods, new housing schemes, and so a lot of persons have lost that sense of community spirit. And while there's a lot that can be said for individual action, that we face that needs collective action. And when we're not engaged fully as a community, sometimes the actions that we embark on are not necessarily successful because too few members in the community are pushing it. So that's one thing in terms of change in mind and perceptions. The other thing is I encourage you to look out on Thursday, which is International Disaster Risk Reduction Day. The launch of this year's World Disaster Report, I think, will give some very interesting insights on change in minds and change in perceptions. The other question that I'd like to just add a little bit more to of what organizations are doing to reduce their own carbon footprint. I had alluded to the Green Response Initiative from Red Cross during my presentation. We've also engaged in doing less physical travel for our meetings, using online forums. The other thing that we are working towards in terms of our emergency response operations is looking at innovative ways of responding to emergencies and new modalities. And this is past the initial emergency phase of the operation. So we're looking at new modalities, for example, like cash transfer, how we reduce the cost and the resources used to get into communities and to reach those that have been affected. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Audience, we have exceeded our time by 7 minutes. We started at 6:30, therefore we should have concluded at 8:30. With your permission, can we have an additional 10 minutes if you so desire in terms of question, but we cannot go beyond that. But if, so do you agree 10 minutes? Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Keith Nurse from WI, not to be confused with my good friend Leonard, who I've benefited immensely from in terms of understanding the whole issue of climate change. I wanted to get into the ointment, which is to say that if the assessments that you have presented are correct, and they're very sobering, and the recommendations and are implemented in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that we aggressively move towards higher levels of mitigation, then it has a knock-on effect, and in fact a requirement in terms of changing both economic and business practices as well as trade, international trade. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that whereas we've been talking largely about the biophysical and ecological impact, there is also a trade impact. And what we know already is that as the particularly developed economies and the high-emitting economies move towards increasing mitigation type strategies, that is going to change our trading patterns in significant ways. The Caribbean and many other small island developing states are long-haul destinations, and any impact on aviation, that impact on maritime industries, will impact on tourism, particularly airline industry, but also on cruise ship industry. And tourism is the lifeblood of the Caribbean and many other small island developing states. There's also the issue of eco-labeling, and the list goes on. These are all policies that are already in train. We've already suffered, to some extent you can argue, from the airline passenger duties from the UK, to suggest that it has had an impact. It means that we need to be talking also about climate change policy impact, which will in effect be also second relative to the biophysical impact. And I think that we are not doing enough work and spending enough resources focused on that issue. I mean, in many respects, we have to complement, as economists, complement the work that you climate change scientists are doing. And so really, we need to step up to the game. So I want to thank you very much for the presentations. I think excellent work, and I want to encourage you to keep on pushing on. So all I'm saying is that there's a climate change governance agenda, and there's a international trade governance agenda, and the two are need to work hand in hand if it is we are to achieve the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that remark. I should like to point out that in the beginning, climate change was considered an environmental issue. Today, we know it is a sustainable development issue, and we have been advocating that we have to think of it in the light of trade, because trade is part of it. The larger industrial countries, they think in terms of what would be the trading impact, and therefore we as a region must also think in terms of when our policymakers are talking or negotiating the aspect of trade should also be considered. I don't think I would want to extend this much further now.
Leslie.
Please, go ahead, sir.
Yes, I just want to pick up on the point raised by Nurse and to ask a very specific question as to the extent to which there is an uptake of the science impact on our policy, our development policy and planning. Secondly, what new skill sets or skill or knowledge sets we need to have to manage this changing society economy that is now impacted by the changing climate, and what we're doing to address that.
I would prefer to say something about the first question. But in relation to the point that Keith raised, he's raised a significant issue about trade and the knock-on effects of global agreements for mitigation, etc., etc. And we've seen some fallout already coming through aviation taxes and so on and so forth. But one, and this is precisely why at the negotiating level, and I hope Leon takes this up a little bit as well, that in the last 5 years or so, AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, has championed cause and fought gallantly against strident protests to get the issue of loss and damages on the agenda of the UNFCCC. To get it on the agenda was a tough fight in itself. And I think that we have to call that a success, because ultimately, after many countries have relented and have agreed to the negotiating agenda, the issue of loss and damages. And it is the intention, and only the intention, I've been coaching the negotiations, is that this adverse impacts from some of mitigation, the global larger mitigation strategies, compensation for those at the level of disadvantaged states will have to be considered under loss and damage. So they're already thinking along the same terms. But what I would invite you to do though, Keith, is to have some of your colleagues, you guys in finance and economics and trade, join the band, because that is where we need some help. I have no expertise, and a lot of my colleagues have very little expertise in that area. But what I will tell you is that they've been fighting gallantly to get that on the agenda, and it is now. And the issue you're raising is embedded right into that issue. The issue of loss and damages embeds trade into it. I don't know whether I got the other question correct. It was, the first part of it at least had to do with the extent to which the take of science is occurring in planning. Is that? I really do not know. I mean, I know that that dabble in science, whether you're university academics, research organizations, colleagues from CIMH, for example, are frequently asked to make to various regional and national planning. And I think that to the extent that we can, we try to show how scientific principles, such as we understand them, can help to guide the planning process. I think governments in the region are making a genuine attempt to do so. That is my personal view. However, that there's still war between putting out fires. There's something now that we must deal with. And as a result, there's a conflict between medium and long-term issues and how we manage them. And I think that that uptake of science into the planning process is frustrated to some extent because of the strictures placed on governments because of lack of resources. The second part of the question, I don't think I'm capable of answering, but that would be my response to the first part.
Leon, do you want to?
Just a quick comment on the first question in terms of how we deal with the impacts of the policy measures. In addition to loss and damage, there is also a particular area area on negotiations which we call response measures, which deals specifically with that issue. That policies which are taken as a means of addressing climate change have unintended adverse impacts on other countries or constituencies, and it's addressed through that thematic impacts of response measures. So it's something that we've already begun to think about. But Dr. Nuss is correct. We need expertise. I mean, when we sit down to develop a curriculum composition on some of these issues, trade is one, agriculture is another, intellectual property rights is another. A lot of our negotiators are people who come from the meteorological and adaptive environmental side of in the rest of so we can get the holistic picture, because once we get past past Paris next year, we're going to be moving more into this kind of arenas. We're going to be moving into implementation. Now, to move into implementation, to look at what's the effects and how we manage them and so on. So, intellectual property rights, agriculture, response, MILs, all these issues we need to bring on the agenda, and it to be very useful if we can establish a dialogue through the center on these issues as early as possible. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. Well, at this point in time, I don't want to abuse the kindness of the audience, and I would like you to join me in thanking the panelists in terms of their presentations. And I'd like to make an announcement before we close the session, in that once you leave here, outside there are some refreshments. It's a little late, but we would like you to partake of the refreshments. Is there to we offer. And at this time, I would like to call on Mr. Patrick McCaskey to give some closing remarks.
Yeah, good evening, gentlemen. I must say that we have had a very rich and stimulating discussion this afternoon. This report clearly highlights a number of challenges that we have, and hence when we have challenges, it means that we have to try to find solutions to these challenges. First of all, let me thank the 5 C's, the CDB, for the organization of this very important event, and also their kind invitation for me to deliver these closing remarks to this discussion. The IPCC's assessment report are the most authoritative source on the science of climate change that we have. And it is indeed very important. Findings will be widely disseminated and also to inform decision makers, both here and in the Caribbean, and also at the international level. What we have learned here this evening is very instructive and represents a strong wake-up call for all of us to act on climate change. We need to build climate change resilience, because climate change, rising seas and ocean acidification have increasingly and disproportionately impacted on small island developing states. Even a 2 or 1.5 degree Celsius warming will likely have this impact on many islands, exceeding their own ability to cope and to adapt. Risks faced by islands and due to climate shocks and impacts could erase decades of development gains. These risks include decreased food security, increased poverty, sea level rise, which would damage cities and coastal infrastructure as well as our economic assets, ocean acidification and coral bleaching, with significant loss of fish production and economic opportunities. And these are just, but please also let me stress another very important point in the context of this discussion, is of staying below the 2 degrees Celsius, which has been amply demonstrated by the IPCC's report to be economically and technically feasible at low global economic costs. This means, therefore, that we still have an opportunity and means to avoid most of these risks that I have just outlined. The IPCC also stresses that increasing international cooperation is a prerequisite to achieve staying below 2 degrees. I am very happy to see a number of my fellow members and alternate members of the Green Climate Fund Board, as well as the Secretariat staff and observers, and above all, my members of the Public Service Minister of the Environment, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of the Environment, members of the 5Cs, Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs, and so on. I'm very happy to see you all, and also, of course, the members of the Caribbean Development Bank. Now, this fund, the Green Climate Fund, will become a key of international cooperation on climate change. And if it fulfills its purpose to make a significant and ambitious contribution to the global effort towards attaining the goal set by the international community, then this will be a true rewarding effort on our part. Now, the fund will also be a unique opportunity for island states to access international for mitigation and adaptation actions. Island states, being the most vulnerable to climate change, have long been a leading force in terms of ambition and action against climate change. Several countries across the region have already voluntarily committed to reduce their emissions through the Barbados Declaration on Achieving Sustainable Energy for all island developing states. So you can see, therefore, that we have high ambitions in the region to lead by example, but implementing this ambition often exceeds our own capacities. I see 2 elements that are missing here. First, we miss adequate and predictable financial support and investments, as well as technological transfer and capacity building to ensure the achievement of our commitments and to cope with and adapt to climate change. We also miss increased technical ability to formulate and develop projects and programs that met the criteria for submission to international support channels. Ladies and gentlemen, the GCF will be well suited to fill both of these gaps, and we can become an important actor for the region. First, an ambitious capitalization of the fund will be important to show countries that international resources are available to support ambitious actions. I therefore call on interested contributors to come forward with pledges that match our ambition. Secondly, the fund's readiness program will help countries to strengthen their national capacities to assess climate change by meeting the fund's standards and formulating high-quality projects and programs, and also identifying priority areas for climate action. We saw today, ladies and gentlemen, in this presentation, that this phenomenon can be catastrophic if solutions are not found and policies in place. What I wish to call for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is, and as a strategic planner, and that I'm an economist, but also a strategic planner, writing a few strategic. I believe that it is important that we have that we develop a regional strategic plan which focuses explicitly on building climate change resilience. Building climate change resilience. And that is very important. Now, I also want to say that, and just to go back, because I don't want, we in the, across cities and developing countries, we are faced with two global crises. We are faced with a global financial crisis, which started in 2000, and you know, you can count back, going back years, all back in 1932 with the Great Depression, and then we have the recession, the Asian financial crisis, but we are currently faced with a global financial crisis, and we are also with a global environmental crisis. And I can't tell you when this crisis started. I know that some professors and so on that can tell me when this global environmental crisis started. And this global environmental crisis is primarily a result of climate change. So it is important, therefore, that we have a strategic plan to deal with these countervailing crises. Global financial crisis, the challenge that has posed to especially cities and developing countries is a lack of, we as a result are finding it very difficult to access finance. Okay? And hence we need, and this came out in one of the presentations, Mr. Trott, is your name, right? Grenadian. He mentioned 5 leading actions that we need to take, and they are very instructive. He mentioned an ambitious mitigation action to deal with greenhouse gases, and I think that was very instructive. And you also mentioned funding for adaptation and mitigation action. And you also mentioned adaptation. You mentioned that adaptation has limits, and that we need to deal with that as well. And you also mentioned the special circumstances faced by cities. And finally, you mentioned that we ensure that we all do what we need to do, and that this will be really binding. I'm just paraphrasing. Now, in closing, let me say, ladies and gentlemen, that the GCF can address the cost of inaction, which is estimated at $22 billion by 2015. Now, if we fail to take the necessary, urgent, and strategic actions which are urgently required, historians will most appropriately condemn us for compromising the future ability of our children and grandchildren. We really cannot fail.
Thank you very much for those closing remarks. At this time, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, the audience, for us, hearing what we had to say, and I hope when you leave here tonight, you will leave with a better understanding of the importance of the IPCC reports. As we said, the first report was issued in 1990, 24 years ago, and therefore, we hope that as we move along, our institutions, our policymakers will take into account the actions that we must take if we are to succeed in having a better climate, not just for our region, but for the world. And therefore, I'd like once again to thank you for joining us tonight for the presentations. And for those of you who are listening through the internet, the Twitter, and the other technological communication means, we also want to thank you. So please join me in a clap for your presence. And now I invite you to go outside and have some refreshments on the 5 Cs and the Caribbean Development Bank. Thank you very much. Panelists, you can't leave it.